Okay, having understood the physical demands, the competitive demands, understanding the types of training content that are there within this sort of, within the training game element, how do we manufacture the session design? What is key when we're looking at trying to put all these things together within this particular training session? So the one thing, I call it a seesaw effect really of the session design. We know there's a high reliability and a stable reliability from the variables. So when we use small-sided games, we're quite comfortable and confident that we get, depending on the condition and the type of game it is, we understand what we're going to get from a physical point of view. Same with transitional games, same with extensive games. And as a result of that, we're able to predetermine the load, which is vitally important when we look at this session design element. And that's something that I'm going to touch more on in the next sort of two elements where I discuss the periodization and tapering strategies. Increasing our understanding from a physical and a technical point of view, and having the coaches understand the outcomes of the training sessions is vitally important. So again, we have a big positive effect on the muscular adaptations, injury prevention aspects of things, because we now start to understand what sessions are going to give us what in terms of the physical output. We know we can impact positional demands and recreate those positional demands through the different types of games. And these are certain key things that we're going to touch on in a minute in terms of the player numbers, the pitch area, and the different variables that we can influence. So we know small-sided games, medium-sided games, large-sided games. If we look at those three elements or three game types that we're looking to try and integrate, we know small-sided games have a higher metabolic load, lots more change of directions, and an increased cardiovascular and strength demand on the players. Whereas we slide across to the larger sided games, where we know we're going to influence more high-speed running, more sprint actions within the bigger spaces. So again, you know, we're trying to overload different energy systems, different muscular aspects by influencing different area sizes. So for example, we look at the player density element again, and it's something that I'm a lot of research in at the moment, especially where we take all our training games, all our possessions, and we basically quantify meters squared per player. And it makes sense. It's very obvious, but it makes sense in terms of there's very small spaces. Yeah, there's very minimal high-speed running. As we slide along the scale from one to another, you can see the larger space or the very large spaces as we get closer to the same sort of player density as a match day situation. We can see that the increase in high-speed running is very apparent. Same with the sprint. So same with sprint distance. As we slide further along, small spaces don't allow players to open up. Very, very simple. Very, very simple. But again, you know, it's quite nice to see it from a visual point of view. The larger the space, the more sprints, the more sprint distance, the more we're sort of allowing players to develop specific actions within a match day situation. And again, max speed hit. So again, higher percentages of max speed hit, very, very common sense approach to it. But again, it's very interesting to be able to show the coaching staff this. If we only ever train in the smaller areas or the medium-sized areas, we're not exposing our players to these max speed demands. There's an argument that maximum speed in football isn't particularly so important. However, on a personal perspective, with some of the research that we've done, we have a huge effect on injury prevention by exposing our players to max speed efforts within the course of every single training week. And again, that's something I'm going to touch on in the next couple of presentations. However, again, this is very, very good visual for coaching staff to understand. You know, I'll give an example of my time in my career where I couldn't understand the fact that, because we all go through a big learning curve in our daily jobs working with these finely tuned athletes. So you have a little look at a player constantly, maybe over a period of time, breaking down certain types of injuries, but then you start to realise that from the coaching staff that you're working with, we only ever train in medium and small areas. It looks really good on the eye, really intense, really sharp. However, we're not exposing our real high-speed players to the high-speed demands that they recreate in a match day. So how can we expect them to reproduce that time and time again in a game when we don't allow that to happen in a training situation? Okay, so we're going to flip onto the outcome variables. Again, well reported. These are well reported within the literature, but when we start to finally look in and really detail it, that we know we can influence our training outcomes, our game related outcomes through the manipulation of some of these key variables. So what are the outcome variables? Pitch area or player density that we've touched on a little bit there. Player numbers, how we can influence that. We've sort of done that as well a little bit by looking at the intensive, the transitional and the extensive games. Game rules, manipulation of rules, changes within the games, how does that affect the outcome? Scoring options, again, another option in terms of being able to manipulate the games. Verbal encouragement, the use of goalkeepers, and the bout duration. So really, really interesting. These are going to be the key things. Circular-wise, these are going to be the key things we're going to discuss. But in the back of your mind, I also want you to note down the fact that the additional variables that we'll talk a little bit further down the line, player level or quality, how they can have a ceiling effect because they can manipulate the ball really well. They make really good decisions. So if they make really good decisions, they don't give the ball away, they don't have to exert themselves in different ways. And then you have the player wellness. So we know from some of the research that if the player, for example, player wellness that we monitor, and we'll touch on that in the next couple of presentations as well, where if they rock up to the training session, the tapering strategy is not particularly good, for example, or they've not recovered well from the previous session, how is that going to affect their intensity? How is that going to affect their quality of training? The player or coach motivation, not just the player, but the coach motivation. Really interesting, verbal encouragement elements, and the facilities available. Again, you know, if you're working with a youth squad, you're working with a semi-professional squad, or you're working with an elite squad, you've got different facilities available. How can you be clever? How can you think outside the box and manipulate elements that you have to drive the outcome variables of what you want? So, changing pitch sizes, pitch area or player density, again, from my point of view, is probably the most important aspect in terms of what we can manipulate to drive the intensity. So even back in 2004, probably what I think was one of the first research studies I got involved with many, many years ago, we looked at the basics, looking at 1v1s, 2v2s, 3v3s, 4v4s versus 11v11 competitive games. By influencing smaller densities, by influencing number of players on the pitch, we can see big changes in attacking and defensive actions. Close proximity, like we spoke about in the intensive games, the smaller sided games, the close proximity of the opposition, the more blocks, the more tackles, the smaller proximity to goals, the more shooting options. So again, you know, we can start to influence particular positional elements, I suppose, or positional demands based on influencing the change, the area size. Again, an infographic just to show again the difference, highlight key points to understand. If we reduce the player numbers within a small set of games, it has a huge impact on the physical demands of the games. So we could see that 1v1s, 2v2s and 3v3s are higher in game, higher heart rate response versus 11v11 competitive games, whereas 3v3s and 4v4s tend to get a little bit closer in terms of the intensity of match type, competitive match type loads. An infographic, again, for coaches. I produce a lot of these for coaches because I think it's really simple for them to see. When we do a smaller sided, just changing the pitch sizes, when we have a little look at opening up the area size with the same number of players, we have a different physical output. And that's something that I'm really, really keen to stress to the coaches, so they get an understanding of pitch manipulation. Player numbers, so we know even if we have the same area size but we manipulate the same pitch, we have a different physiological and physical characteristic. We decrease the player number involved in the session, we increase the technical exposure as well. So it's not necessarily just the physical side of things, but it's the demand on the players from a technical perspective to improve. So again, this is that physical, technical, psychological, the integrated approach, which is all constantly there every single time we step onto the pitch. Small-sided games generally result in an increased physiological response, and again, some of the literature has already suggested that blood lactate values and heart rate values are a result of the increase in the technical demand and exposure. And something that when we start to integrate some of the different psychological processes within changing player numbers, there's a thing called the social loafing theory. So for me, I'm trying to understand how that can affect. So basically, smaller groups of people, 2 and 3 people, where everybody's working really well on a task because they know there's a smaller element, there's a smaller group, a tighter cohesion, everybody's information is extremely important. As we start to increase the number of people within this group, certain individuals can become a little bit lazy, can start to pass on responsibility, and I'm really interested in bridging that link. You know, from a 3v3, you're under pressure to perform, because if you don't perform, you let your 2 teammates down. Whereas when I go into a 10v10 game, how many of those players, their motivation, is it as high or is it as low as when they're in a 3v3 situation? So again, it's a really interesting theory that may add a little bit of a understanding of why the intensity drops a little bit. I don't know, or personal motivation. Again, another infographic, another research study performed where we looked at purely heart rate responses of small versus large-sided games. Very, very basic. Really good for coaches to understand as well. If we only ever do small-sided games, yes, they drive the heart rate high and cause a big cardiovascular fatigue and an overload. However, if we only ever do large-sided games, we get a totally different response, low heart rates. And we can see that here in the graph. So we can see, for example, maximum heart rates, an average heart rate in the circles of 3v3 small-sided games, and you can see that statistically they're significantly higher than when we do 9v9s in terms of the maximum and versus the mean heart rate. So again, you know, another example of showing the differences between player numbers and game type manipulations. The cardiovascular load is significantly higher, but also the technical demand is significantly higher as well. So again, it helps. What it's helping to do is justify everything that we spoke about previously when we talk about the 3 different game types. So again, it's adding more value to what we do when we make decisions about what we do, and then further down the line when we talk about the tapering aspects of training, we'll talk a little bit about how these things influence our daily and our weekly content. Again, the research papers published on the various sided games. So again, not only are we taking small, medium and large sided games and manipulating them from a physical perspective to prepare players properly, but we now have the research to justify what we're doing. Scoring options, the next variable. There's limited research into this, but there's a couple of papers out there suggesting how scoring methods may affect the physical outcomes, which again is another way of being able to manipulate the intensity of what we're doing. So some of the scoring options utilised currently out there, or have been discussed or utilised on a daily basis, self included: regular goals, set number of passes of possession per goal, working the ball through a specific target player or over a certain line, multi-directional games and multiple goal targets. Again, you know, 2-goal games, 4-goal games, pole games with, you know, 6 or 7 different pole games where again, this is where you as a coach can become, the imagination, use your imagination, but the key is, what do you want to generate out of the session before you're going into it? Smaller goals versus traditional side goals may limit the player's goal scoring opportunities due to a reduced target. So if the shot's not on to do, we have to recycle the ball, come out, so it drives the intensity. So again, what I want you to think about, and when you're working with coaches or you're working as a coach yourself from some particular elements, is to understand why you do what you do. If you don't have a justification for it, then why are you doing it? And again, that's something we're going to continue with the theme right the way through the presentation. One particular research study looking into 3 various goal scoring methods. So with game A, we can see getting the ball over a line. Game B, where 4 mini goals, attacking 2, defending 2, and game C based on a regular sort of 4v4 with 2 mini goals. Line game A, significantly increased heart rate responses versus games B and C. Again, makes sense because you have to take the ball into an area, or you have to drive the ball over the line, as opposed to being able to, a little bit fatigued, taking a shot. So again, it's interesting to just start to understand how scoring options can influence things. And one such infographic that we put together based on the fact, again, trying to increase that coach knowledge is, as soon as we go into a possession game where it might be on maintaining possession with no scoring opportunities versus putting goals in with goalkeepers, the motivation's always higher with players trying to get a shot off at goal, which drives intensity. However, a keep ball possession game drives the intensity significantly higher, as you can see here. So again, a 4v4 plus goalkeepers, the inclusion of goalkeepers versus possession games without goalkeepers, intensities are significantly different. Again, so I want you to understand what decisions you make about how you develop your training content and how that will influence the demand on the players. Game rules. Game rules significantly affect the physical demands on the players within the training games. One investigation involving the use of rule changes at the elite level have been done. And the research for this, or the outcome of this particular research, was really interesting, but again, very, very common sense approach to it. Increased RPE and blood lactate levels found when small-sided games involved free play versus limited touches per possession, which makes sense. We have to move the ball quicker. We have to move ourselves. We have to be a little bit more sort of proactive in terms of taking up positions, assisting man on the ball. So there's many different reasons for it. But again, it's really good that the research is there to help justify the decisions on. We all work with coaches, or for example, where it might be, right, this game's 2-touch, this game's 3-touch, this game's all in. Well, what is the outcome? What is the outcome of the session, and why are you putting those particular rules on the players? What are you wanting to drive from a physical perspective? What sort of stimulus are we wanting to approach? Another study used man-to-man marking. So man-to-man marking versus just general free play. And again, the research shows an increase, 5%, approximately 4.5-5% increase in heart rate response using man-to-man rules. So again, this happens within certain areas of the game. So in larger sided games, are you able to use units as man-to-man marking where everybody else is general or zonal? Again, so these things are really interesting, but again, it's really great to be able to actually justify what we're doing through the use of research. And that's probably one thing that I really want you all to understand, is the fact that you have to have a justification for what you do on a daily basis with session design, understanding the outcome variables. Again, this is based on real information from the elite level over the years. So we have a free play versus 3-touch, same-sided game, same area size, but again, we get to see the difference in the free play versus the 3-touch. 3-touch drives the intensity higher, drives more high-speed running, drives more distance covered, so the bigger physical demand is there when we limit it. So again, not only are we taking the research, we're also taking the practical elements and the data on a daily basis.